There's a specific moment that catches almost everyone off guard, no matter how much they've learned, no matter how many patterns they've come to recognize in hindsight. It's not the cruelty. By now, most people who've lived through one of these relationships can spot cruelty fairly quickly, name it, brace against it. What catches people off guard is the opposite: the sudden, unexpected kindness that arrives out of nowhere, disarming in exactly the way cruelty never manages to be, because kindness doesn't trigger the same defenses. It slips past them entirely, and that's precisely the problem worth understanding today. This is what we're exploring, and I want to be direct about why this topic matters as much as it does. Almost every resource on narcissistic relationships focuses on recognizing the harmful behavior, the manipulation, the cruelty, the cycles of devaluation. Far fewer focus on something considerably more disorienting: the danger hidden inside the good moments, the sudden warmth, the unexpected generosity, the gestures that seem to finally that the person you fell for really is still in there somewhere. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why these moments deserve just as much scrutiny as the cruel ones, sometimes even more, and what they're actually doing beneath their pleasant surface. Let's start with something worth naming clearly, because it reframes everything that follows. Sudden kindness in these relationships is rarely random, and it's rarely disconnected from what came immediately before or immediately after it. Remember everything we've traced throughout this series about intermittent reinforcement, the psychological mechanism where unpredictable rewards create considerably stronger attachment than consistent ones ever could. Sudden kindness is the reward half of this mechanism, and understanding its actual function, rather than simply its surface appearance, is what allows you to see it clearly instead of being disarmed by it every single time it arrives. Here's what's worth understanding about the timing specifically, because timing reveals function more reliably than content ever does. Sudden kindness in these relationships tends to arrive at predictable junctures, even though it rarely feels predictable in the moment it's happening. It shows up after periods of coldness or cruelty, specifically when the accumulated tension has built to a point where you might genuinely be considering distance or departure. It shows up after you've held a boundary successfully, specifically when the old methods of eroding that boundary have failed and something different needs to be attempted. And it shows up preemptively, before a request or an ask that would otherwise meet resistance, softening the ground in advance for something that's about to be needed. This is worth sitting with directly, because it explains why sudden kindness feels so genuinely convincing in the moment, even to people who understand intellectually exactly how these patterns work. Kindness doesn't require the same suspicion that cruelty does, because kindness aligns with what you've always wanted from this relationship in the first place. When it finally arrives, even predictably, even at a suspiciously convenient moment, it satisfies something real and long-standing, the hope that the person you first connected with, the one who seemed capable of real warmth and real understanding, still exists underneath everything else. This hope isn't foolish. It's exactly what makes you human, and it's exactly what this pattern has learned to exploit with remarkable precision. Let's talk about what actually happens internally when sudden kindness arrives after a difficult stretch, because understanding this mechanism explains why it's considerably more disorienting than ordinary cruelty ever manages to be. Cruelty produces a clear, recognizable response: hurt, anger, the urge to protect yourself. Sudden kindness produces something considerably more complicated, a kind of internal reset, where the accumulated evidence of harm suddenly feels less certain, less urgent, less deserving of the response you were building toward. This isn't a failure of judgment on your part. It's a predictable psychological response to reward arriving after deprivation, the same mechanism that makes intermittent reinforcement so powerful in the first place. The kindness doesn't just feel good on its own terms. It feels good specifically because of what came before it, and that contrast is what makes it function so effectively as a kind of emotional reset button. Here's something worth naming directly, because it's rarely discussed with enough precision. Sudden kindness often arrives with a specific, disproportionate intensity, considerably larger and more dramatic than the situation would normally call for. An ordinary apology becomes an elaborate gesture. A simple acknowledgement becomes a grand declaration. This disproportion is worth understanding as itself a signal, because genuine, sustained warmth in healthy relationships doesn't typically require this kind of dramatic intensity in order to register as real. It's simply present, consistently, without needing to overwhelm in order to be believed. The specific intensity of sudden kindness in these dynamics serves a function worth naming clearly. It needs to be large enough to override the accumulated evidence of harm that preceded it. And this requirement for largeness is itself worth recognizing as a marker that something strategic, even if not fully conscious, is happening underneath the pleasant surface. Let's talk about a second reason sudden kindness deserves scrutiny, one that connects to something we've traced throughout many explorations in this series. What it actually costs you internally to keep believing in these moments as evidence of genuine change. Every time sudden kindness arrives and gets received as proof that things are finally different, that this time represents a real shift rather than a repeated pattern, something important gets reset alongside the emotional reaction itself. The clarity you'd been building, the boundary you'd been strengthening, the resolve you'd been gathering toward genuine change or genuine departure, all of it gets quietly undermined, not through confrontation, but through exactly the kind of hope that sudden kindness is so effective at reactivating. This is worth understanding as the actual danger this exploration's title refers to, and it's worth stating plainly. The risk isn't that kindness itself is inherently bad, or that you should never allow yourself to feel good when someone treats you well. The risk is considerably more specific, sudden, disproportionate, conveniently timed kindness that arrives without any accompanying pattern of sustained, consistent change functions as a reset mechanism, one that keeps you perpetually rebuilding the same clarity you'd already worked hard to establish over and over, each time slightly more exhausted, slightly more confused about what you actually know to be true. What we haven't yet explored is what specifically distinguishes sudden kindness from genuine change, how to tell the difference in real time rather than only in hindsight, and why learning this distinction, more than almost anything else we've traced throughout this exploration, protects something considerably more valuable than your emotional comfort. In any single moment, your own accumulated clarity is built patiently over time and worth protecting from being reset again and again by exactly the kind of moments that feel each time like they might finally be different. Let's talk directly about how to distinguish sudden kindness from genuine change, because this is the practical core of everything this exploration has been building toward. The distinction isn't found in how the kindness feels in the moment it arrives, because, as we established in Part 1, it's specifically designed to feel convincing, disproportionate, and emotionally overwhelming enough to override whatever clarity preceded it. The distinction is found somewhere else entirely in what happens afterward, over time, independent of the emotional high the kindness itself produced. Here's the first marker worth understanding precisely. Genuine change tends to be accompanied by acknowledgement of the specific behavior that needed to change, delivered without an immediate pivot into justification or an immediate expectation of praise for offering it. Sudden kindness, by contrast, often arrives without any direct acknowledgement at all, functioning instead as a kind of unspoken substitute for accountability, as though warmth itself should be sufficient to address whatever harm preceded it, without requiring any actual naming of what happened or why. If you notice that kindness consistently arrives as a replacement for acknowledgement rather than alongside it, this is worth understanding as a meaningful signal, because genuine repair and performed repair tend to differ specifically at this exact point. Let's talk about the second marker, one that connects directly to something we've traced extensively throughout this series, whether the kindness requires an audience or specific timing in order to occur. Genuine warmth in healthy relationships tends to show up consistently, in private moments as readily as in witnessed ones, unconnected to any particular strategic timing. Sudden kindness in these dynamics tends to cluster suspiciously around specific junctures, immediately following conflict, immediately preceding a request, or specifically at moments when your own resolve has become strong enough to threaten the relationship's continuation. If you find yourself able to predict, with reasonable accuracy, when kindness is likely to arrive based on what's been happening in the relationship recently, this predictability itself is worth understanding as meaningful information, because genuine warmth doesn't typically follow such a legible, strategic pattern. Now let's talk about the third and most important marker, because it's the one that actually requires patience rather than in the moment analysis, whether the kindness is followed by sustained behavioral change, extending well beyond the immediate aftermath of the gesture itself. This is worth understanding as the single most reliable test available, precisely because it can't be faked through any single gesture, however dramatic or convincing. Sudden kindness that represents genuine underlying change tends to be followed by weeks and months of quieter, less dramatic but genuinely consistent behavior, a gradual shift in how conflict gets handled, how your boundaries get respected, how your concerns get received, that continues independent of whether the relationship's stability currently feels threatened or secure. Sudden kindness that represents the reset mechanism we discussed in Part 1 tends to be followed by a gradual, often difficult to pinpoint return to the previous pattern. Once the immediate crisis that prompted the kindness has passed and your resolve has softened enough that dramatic intervention no longer feels necessary, This is worth understanding as requiring genuine patience to properly evaluate, and it's worth naming why this patience matters so much. The entire function of sudden kindness depends on producing an immediate reaction, a reset that happens quickly, before enough time has passed to reveal whether anything has actually sustainably changed. This means the most protective thing available to you when sudden kindness arrives isn't suspicion delivered in the moment, which can feel harsh and premature even when it's ultimately warranted. It's simply time, deliberately allowed to pass, before drawing any conclusions about what the kindness actually means. This delay doesn't require you to reject the kindness outright or refuse to acknowledge that it felt genuinely good to receive. It simply requires postponing the conclusion that this specific instance represents genuine, lasting change, until enough time has actually passed to test that conclusion honestly. Let's talk about a specific, practical tool worth developing here, one that connects directly to something we discussed in an earlier exploration throughout this series regarding delayed response, keeping a private, honest record, even if only mental rather than written, of previous instances of sudden kindness and what actually followed them. This is worth understanding as considerably more useful than relying on memory alone, because memory in these situations tends to be shaped by exactly the same mechanism that makes sudden kindness so effective in the first place: the tendency for recent, emotionally intense positive moments to overshadow the accumulated pattern of what actually happened before and after similar moments in the past. A private, honest record maintained consistently over time allows you to check any new instance of sudden kindness against genuine historical pattern, rather than against the emotionally compelling, but often unreliable feeling of the present moment alone. Here's what's worth understanding about why this record keeping matters so much specifically in this context, connecting back to everything we've traced throughout this series about how these dynamics erode self-trust over time. Part of what makes sudden kindness so disorienting is that it doesn't just produce hope about the future. It actively interferes with accurate memory of the past, making previous instances of similar, ultimately unsustained kindness feel less relevant, less connected to whatever is currently happening than they actually are. A private record counters this interference directly, providing an anchor of accurate information that doesn't depend on memory remaining reliable during exactly the moments when reliability matters most and is hardest to maintain. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what all of this actually means for how you should think about kindness itself going forward. Not just within this specific relationship if it's ongoing, but in every relationship you build from this point forward, and why learning to properly evaluate kindness, rather than either accepting it uncritically or rejecting it defensively, represents one of the most valuable and most protective skills available from everything we've traced throughout this entire exploration. Let's talk about what this actually means going forward, because everything we've traced across this exploration needs to resolve into something you can carry into every relationship you build from here, not just the one that may have prompted this particular exploration. It would be easy to walk away from everything we've discussed with a distorted lesson that kindness itself is dangerous, that warmth should always be treated with suspicion, that the safest approach is simply to distrust generosity wherever it appears. This isn't actually what this exploration has been building toward, and it's worth correcting this potential misunderstanding directly, because getting this wrong would cost you something valuable in every future relationship, not just protect you from harm in this one. Here's the accurate distinction worth carrying forward. The danger was never kindness itself. The danger was specifically kindness functioning as a substitute for accountability, kindness arriving with suspicious, strategic timing, and kindness that fails to produce any sustained behavioral change once enough time has passed to test it honestly. Genuine kindness, the kind that exists in healthy relationships, it doesn't share these three markers. It doesn't need to override accumulated evidence of harm, because it isn't compensating for ongoing harm in the first place. It doesn't cluster suspiciously around moments of relational threat, because it isn't functioning as a strategic reset. And it's accompanied, reliably, by sustained behavior that matches its promise over time, because it was never actually separate from genuine, consistent character to begin with. This distinction matters enormously for your own future. It's because learning to distrust all kindness indiscriminately would cost you the ability to recognize and receive genuine warmth when it eventually, hopefully, arrives from someone whose character actually supports it consistently. The goal was never to become someone who can no longer trust kindness at all. The goal was to become someone who evaluates kindness accurately, checking it against pattern and time rather than accepting it purely on the strength of how convincing it feels in any single moment, however emotionally compelling that moment happens to be. Let's talk about what this evaluation actually looks like in practice, going forward, because it's worth making concrete rather than leaving it abstract. When kindness arrives, from anyone, in any relationship, the useful question isn't simply, does this feel good? Because feeling good, as we've established throughout this entire exploration, is precisely what sudden kindness is designed to produce regardless of what it actually represents underneath. The useful question is considerably more specific. Does this kindness arrive alongside genuine acknowledgement of whatever came before it? Does it appear consistently rather than at suspiciously strategic moments? And does it get followed by sustained behavior that matches its promise over meaningful time, rather than dissolving once the immediate tension that produced it has passed? This isn't a question you need to answer immediately, in the moment kindness arrives. It's a question you can hold patiently, allowing time itself to provide the answers, rather than requiring yourself to resolve it through analysis alone, in real time, while still inside the emotional pull of the moment. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. It's one that ties together the specific topic of sudden kindness with something considerably larger this entire series has been building toward from its very beginning. Learning to evaluate kindness accurately, rather than accepting it uncritically or rejecting